Near fatal episode number 3. Quentin and Teresa awoke to an unseasonably warm winter morning, and also to the commotion that always occurred via Otis and Tiffany. The couple was polar opposites of Quentin and Teresa. Otis and Tiffany would argue at the drop of a dime and physically go at it for hours at a time. If you can remember the mid-90s fiascos of the Jerry Springer show, then you would have a front row seat to their battles, as it always seemed to spark during Jerry's televised boxing matches. This particular occasion would serve as the catalyst to the mayhem Quentin and Otis would soon encounter. After a morning of bickering, Otis felt the need to drink his sorrows away with the likes of Crazy Horse, the type of alcoholic beverage sold in a 32-ounce bottle that could ignite a campfire, start the engine to a pickup truck, and encouraged an unlicensed felon to drive on a dark highway. Although Quentin did not drive much, mainly due to his license being suspended for unpaid violations, he continued to carry it with him for identification purposes. This gesture would serve to be the defining factor during their evening of a tumultuous event. After getting wasted, the lads decided to visit a few of Otis's friends who lived in a complex nearby. After an hour of putting their heads together regarding what they could get into for the night, one of the fellows insisted that they all go to a fast food joint to get some free food. His girlfriend worked there and knew she would automatically oblige. She certainly did, and the group went about their way back to East Point, or so they thought. 2 to 3 minutes after pulling out of the restaurant's parking lot, Otis made a sudden right turn on a 2-lane road that usually encompassed traffic that moved in opposite directions. The red Civic ended up in the lane that could have easily embodied a tractor trailer coming full speed in their direction. To make matters worse, Otis lost control on the left shoulder. The car tipped off a cliff, plummeting down a few hundred yards where a lake awaited them. They tumbled down, flipping completely over about 8 to 10 times. They were halted what felt like a ledge, in which the car rocked back and forth for what seemed like 5 minutes, but in actual time, a few seconds. Immediately, Quentin grabbed onto the car's upper handlebar on his side. During the pause, the only sound that could be heard is the slight whistling sound of the wind, as if they were between life and death. At an instant, the car began cartwheeling down the cliff. Boom! A tree then ceased their avalanche. The car was flipped over onto its left side. Quentin opened his eyes, and his window was pointed vertically towards the moon. He looked over to the driver's side, and there were no signs of Otis. The fellow seated behind Quentin quickly climbed out of his car door window. The fellow seated next to him could not follow suit because his left foot was wedged between the car and the bark of the tree. Quentin climbed out of his window. He and the other guy stared at one another in total disbelief of what had just occurred. The shock of them surviving this accident truly exacerbated their communal emotions. They attempted to nudge the car with all of their might to help release the other guy's foot. After a while, they were successful. They called out to Otis, to no avail. They automatically thought that he was thrown out of the car during the plunge. The young men crawled up the overhang to the street level. At this point, there were quite a few people who obviously heard the eye-squinting, ear-throbbing sound of what they just encountered. When they reached street level, they looked down at where the car laid with the engine still running. One would automatically assume that no one involved could endure this travesty by the sight of the vehicle's condition. An older white man appeared on the side of Quentin and asked, "Is anyone else down there?" He replied, "Yeah, my cousin." Without hesitation, the guy rebutted, "Y'all best go down there and get him because that car is about to explode." Quentin looked to his left where the other two fellows were and insisted that they come back with him down the cliff to rescue Otis. They turned the other cheek as if Jesus, him or herself, had summoned or whispered the scripture of Matthew 5:38-39 in their ears. With not a thought, Quentin retreated down the hill to find Otis and risk uncertain danger. As he approached the total vehicle, he called out, "Otis! Otis!" After 8 Relentless beckons, he heard a muffling sound coming from inside the vehicle. It was Otis. He was stuck, full body, under the driver's seat. Now, Otis stood about 6 feet and weighed 170 pounds, and to this day, it is still unfathomable how this adult-sized man fit in that space. Quentin jumped through the window and miraculously pulled Otis out of the vehicle. Quentin was about 140 pounds soaking wet, therefore only a higher power could have given him the strength and adrenaline to pull Otis out of the vehicle. Otis was able to stand upright, but oblivious to what just transpired. All he could mumble to Quentin was, "What happened?" Otis must have been in shock, still under the influence, or affected by a concussion that just evaporated his memory of the previous 20 minutes. Quentin led his cousin up to the steep cliff onto street level where the authorities were waiting to discuss what had transpired, and of course, what or who caused the accident. There were 2 officers, a younger patrolman who did not really seem that concerned if alcohol had anything to do with the chain of events, and an older gentleman who looked identical to Archie Bunker, who seemed truly curious about what or who would cause an entire vehicle to completely tumble off a cliff. The other 2 guys fled the scene when they heard the sirens of the boys in blue due to their possession of narcotics and its paraphernalia. Quentin instantaneously sobered up when he viewed how gung-ho the older gentleman was with getting down to the bottom of this situation. Quentin had a pull-over chap's windbreaker on with a zipper in the front, which contained a half ounce of marijuana. This was the 90s, and medicinal, let alone recreational, usage of cannabis was not readily acceptable as it is in 33 states nowadays. Marijuana was truly foreseen as drugs, dope, or a substance that would land you in prison. This was not the time or place for Quentin to get nervous, as Otis was noticeably not in a cerebral state of mind. The younger gentleman asked Otis who was driving, and without the slightest thought, he said, "He was," pointing at Quentin. At first, Quentin did not know why he gestured to him being the driver. Then he remembered that he had the driver's license that, coincidentally, had been revoked months prior. He was not sure if Otis was aware of the revocation or the illegal plant he had in his possession for that matter. Quentin corroborated his cousin's retort, being sure to make steady eye contact with Archie, and proceeded to the patrol car to have his license verified. His heart began to palpitate almost as if he were about to speak to thousands of onlookers while singled out on stage. He went into his wallet and gave the officer his license, which could serve as the conduit to 3 offenses: driving with a revoked license, driving under intoxication, and possession of drugs. The half ounce alone can land him in jail for up to a year and a fine of $1,000. Unlike Otis, Quentin had never been in jail, let alone detained for any infractions. As the older patrolman typed in Quentin's information to check his driving status, Quentin kept conversation to somehow provoke sympathy once the officer retrieved his revocation. After about 10 minutes of internal sweating and anxiety, Archie Bunker looked up and said the 3 words every black man would put his life on the line to hear while being detained by the authorities. "Okay, you're good." Quentin could not help but to stare at the guy for a few seconds after this phenomenon from the heavens above had occurred. Had Quentin saved children from a burning orphanage in his previous life, provided a village of Ethiopians with food, water, and shelter, or was it the storybook ending to a climactic change of events that almost costed him, and would ironically be the tipping point in his life? They stepped out of the patrol car with Quentin feeling like he had just cured world hunger. To no surprise to anyone reading this, Otis was getting arrested for babbling in his drunken stupor. For the past 25 years, Otis has been in and out of prison for 1 to 3 year stints, every time the Olympics occurred, for repetitive offenses. It is fair to say that Otis is a career criminal. In contrast, Quentin moved back to Michigan, went back to school, received a graduate degree in psychology, and now is a regionally recognized motivational speaker, shedding light on youths who claim to be and are afraid to change their harsh realities. Reflection. Change is a terrifying act of transforming one's mind, body, or emotional embodiment. The notion of change is merely a matter of perspective. At times, we are verbally, physically, or symbolically encouraged to create a form of change in our lives. This attempt to shed a different light on life can only be gestured by those who have confronted the dimmer side of the tunnel on their darkest day. The inevitable sets of circumstances that all of us encounter throughout life must be embraced, despite the necessary bumps in the road, temporary halts of progression, and temptation to no longer move forward. The great Dr. George C. Fraser once said, "Anything you strive for and become successful at is located on the other side of hard."